Again, it's a redskin.
What is going on, guys? Welcome back. In today's video, we're going to talk about Python coding conventions that you should follow to make your code more professional, more beautiful, and more readable. So let us get right into it. Now, before we get into the actual tutorial, I would like to mention that this video is sponsored by Oxylabs. And as always, don't skip this part because I never promote something unless I think it's useful and interesting to my audience. And Oxylabs offers something very interesting for those of you who are interested in web scraping and gathering large amounts of data on the internet. They offer proxy servers, professional proxy servers, that can save you a lot of hours of dealing with technical issues, with networking issues. If you have ever done web scraping in the past, large-scale web scraping, you probably noticed that you have constantly some IP blocking, some CAPTCHAs, some servers being down, and so on. You can solve these problems with Oxylabs because they offer you reliable servers, IP addresses that are legit, that are actually registered by ISPs or at ISPs for real users, so they're not suspicious. You can use them without having to constantly prove that you're a human and so on, so you can actually focus on the work that you want to do on the web scraping, on the data science, whatever you're web scraping for. You can focus on that. They have a success rate of average 99.2%, and the residential proxies offer, as I said, 100 million plus legit IPs from 195 countries. You can also take a look at their quick start. You can use this with curl, with a command line tool on Linux, on Windows. You can use it for PHP, and probably most interesting for you guys, you can use it with Python as well. You can look at the tutorial here to see how it's done. You can specify a server. You can also specify the country, the city. You can do all of this manually, and these are legitimate IP addresses, reliable service. The company is very reliable. If you go to Reddit and you look for best proxy servers that you can use for web scraping, you're going to see Oxylabs, maybe with one or two competitors, but they're actually at the top of this business. You can see Java, C#, Ruby, and so on. A very interesting company, very interesting products, and if you are into large-scale data gathering on the web, if you are into large-scale web scraping, this is definitely worth a try, worth a look. They have a free trial, and for this video specifically, you have a link in the description down below with a coupon code, with a Neural9 coupon code that you can use to check their products out. So take a look. I think it's very interesting. So the conventions and styling guidelines that I present to you in this video are taken from the PEP 8 style guide for Python code. You could say that this is the central thing that developers agree on, the central resource that you want to look at if you want to make your Python code more readable and more professional. Now, of course, some companies like Google have their own styling guidelines, which makes sense. If you have a big team of developers on different projects, working on different projects, you want to have your own custom guidelines. But in general, the PEP 8 is what you want to follow if you want to make your code more readable. Now, before we get into the actual individual points here, I want to talk about some general guidelines. And the first thing that you need to get into your mind, into your head, is that the primary goal here, the North Star, is readability. You want to make your code more readable. You don't want to make it fancy. You don't want to follow some rules foolishly. You don't want to have foolish consistency. You want to make your code more readable, which means that if in your project certain guidelines lead to less readability, you ignore those. If breaking the rules one or two times leads to more readability, you do it. You just want to make your code as professional and as readable as possible. You don't want to make a religion out of following these guidelines here. They have the goal of making your code more professional and more readable. If they don't do that, you don't follow them. It's as simple as that. Also, all these guidelines here are just styling guidelines. So nothing is going to improve about your code in general. So you're not going to have more functionality or more efficiency or anything like that. It's just going to make it easier for developers, including yourself, to understand the code and to refactor the code and to read the code. It's not going to change anything about the program itself. And one thing that you might want to follow here is you can go into your Python idle and just type import this. This is the Zen of Python. Those are just some general soft guidelines, nothing specific, nothing like line length or characters to use. Just some basic guidelines like beautiful is better than ugly, explicit is better than implicit, simple is better than complex, and so on. Because oftentimes we have these lead coders that have like the perfect line of code, one line of code that does 1,000 things, but no one can understand it. That is not good code. This might help you in some coding competitions when it's about writing the shortest code possible, but it's not going to help you in actual programming. You want to keep things simple and readable, not fancy and lead coder like. All right, so let us get right into the first big category of guidelines related to aesthetics and layout. And we're going to start with some very basic stuff. First, the tab width or tabs in general. The guideline recommends to have a tab width, to use a tab width of 4, which means that you don't want to use 2, you don't want to use 8. The guideline says use 4, and it also says that spaces are preferred over tabs. So I'm not sure if my editor, if PyCharm here does it actually, but it says that it's better to use 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces than one tab character. I think actually PyCharm uses tabs in this case. But this is one thing that you might want to change, because spaces are actually more concrete. They're not ambiguous. Tabs can be 4 characters long, 2 characters long, and so on. So spaces are concrete. You have 4 spaces, and this means the code is indented. So it's recommended to use spaces over tabs. Another thing is you want to keep track of the maximum line length. So recommended maximum line length is 79 characters. Why? Because usually that's the kind of length that you can use if you have a normal default font size, which is not the case for me right now because I'm recording. But if you have 79 characters in a line, you can use split view without causing the text to wrap. So without causing line wrapping, you can have two buffers open with code. And 79 characters is usually what you have, what is acceptable here to have as a maximum line length. Of course, you can also choose a different maximum line length for your company if you have a team of developers. It's important to have a convention, because then you can know that if this is the maximum line length, I can have 2 windows side by side without causing line wrapping. And for long blocks of text, for example, for multi-line comments that are large, you want to have 72 as a recommended guideline here. Now, this is interesting here. We have seen this in my tutorials quite often. You want to have, when you define a class, for example, when you define class, my class, it's the convention that you have 2 blank lines above that, and I think also below that. And also the same goes for top level functions. So let me show you here. If I have, I don't know, my function inside of the class here, the convention says, I'm going to just pass for now. The convention says that if you have functions inside of a class, you want to separate them by 1 blank line. So if I have my function 2 here, and I pass here as well, this is fine. You don't want to have 2 blank lines in here. As you can see, if I hover here now, it says PEP8, which is the guideline that we talked about. Too many blank lines. This should not be the case. So also, if I have something else here, for example, I say a equals 10, then I'm going to have the problem here, PEP8, expected 2 blank lines, found 1. This is not according to the convention. If I add an additional blank line here, everything is fine again. Also, as far as I know, this is also true for comments. So if I have a comment here, no, in this case it's not, but I think the difference is if I have a equals 10 here, yeah, then it's a problem because I don't have 2 blank lines. I have a statement, then the comments are ignored, and I have 1 blank line. So you want to have 2 blank lines when you define a class or when you define a top level function. So if I say here special and then I pass, you want to have 2 blank lines before that as well. Now, inside of the class, as I already said, you want to have only 1 blank line between the functions. However, the guideline says that it's allowed to use extra blank lines sparingly, so not too often, to separate certain categories of functions. So if you have, for example, a huge class with 100 functions, and then you have like 15 mathematical functions, 15 string processing functions, 15 graphical processing functions, whatever reason you have these functions, you can use an extra blank line. So if you have these 2 functions here, for example, then 2 blank lines to start a new block of functions. This is allowed, this is recommended, but don't do it too often. And also, what's also useful is if you have a function, inside of that function, you want to have the statements separated by blank lines into logical sections. So for example, if we're working with sockets, we might want to have a section where we initialize the socket, we bind the socket, we start listening, then we want to have a separate section for accepting a connection, handling a connection, and then you want to have a separate section that closes the connection, cleans up the resources, and so on. And these sections We can call them section 1 here. Oh, we're in Python. Section 1. And then you have section 2 and so on. These sections should be separated by blank lines because they have a logical reason to be separated. So that's it for the blank lines in classes and functions. Now, another thing is no unnecessary white spaces. I think this is something that's quite intuitive. You don't want to have white spaces when there's no reason to have them. I don't know, for example, if I have my list is some array here, some list 1, 2, 3, 4. It doesn't make a lot of sense to call a function, I don't know, my function, onto that list, and then I say my list, and then space here again, space here, 1 space, and maybe pass something else here. These blank lines here, these white spaces here, they don't make sense. And as you can see here, PEP8 says white space after a opening bracket doesn't make a lot of sense in here as well. It doesn't make sense to use white spaces in this case. What does make sense is, and I think it's even, yeah, as you can see here I should have white spaces. If I have 1, 2, 3, 4, this is recommended to have white spaces here. It depends on the context. If you want to know all the details, I recommend reading the guidelines or just using something like PyCharm that tells you if you violate the convention. What is acceptable here, for example, is if you use a slicing operator. So if you have something like my list, it is okay to slice. So if you have like slice and then, I don't know, some function that returns something, some number, and then slice again, some other number, and so on. This is fine usually. But again, if you want to know all the details, you want to read the guideline, the PEP8 guideline. But in general, don't use spaces unnecessarily. So if you have certain, I don't know, if you just call a function, there's no reason to add surrounding white spaces for no reason. But I think this is quite intuitive. You don't do that unnecessarily. Now you also want to have between operators. Did I actually? Oh, there you go. Between operators, you want to have white spaces, but you don't want to have them. You don't want to have white spaces if you have certain priorities. So, for example, if I have the calculation C equals 10 plus 20 plus 30, there should be spaces. I should not do it like that. This is not conventional. I'm not sure if it's going to underline it here. No, it doesn't say anything. But this is actually not according to the convention. What is according to the convention, however, is if I have certain blocks. So for example, if I say C equals, and then I have x to the power of 2 plus y to the power of 3 and so on, this is conventional. It's even recommended then to group these together without white spaces and to only add the white spaces here. So this is also a conventional thing to follow. Then also, if you have a function, this is important. If you have a function, def my function, and you have some parameter here, some keyword parameter, maybe you have x, y, and then you have some other thing, and this some other thing has a certain default value. When you assign a default value, you want to use a white space here, so you want to have this being none, for example. This is conventional to do it like that. Let's just pass for now. But when you call the function, so when I call my function, for example, and I enter 10, 20, when I now assign some other thing manually, like that as a keyword argument, then we don't use white spaces. So if I say 10 here, for example, you don't want to use white spaces. Now I think we have some other problem here. Yeah, we need 2 blank lines. But this here is also against the guideline. As you can see, unexpected spaces around keyword parameter equals. This is not recommended. Then we have 2 more things. If you define a tuple with 1 element, so if I say my tuple equals, now if I have multiple elements, it's easy, I just do that, of course with spaces. But if I have just 1 element, I don't do it like that, I do it like that. This is the recommended way to assign a 1 value tuple. And last but not least, the files you use should have the encoding UTF-8, so UTF-8. All right, so let's move on to the next category, the import guidelines. And this is actually something that I think is quite interesting because I oftentimes ask myself in the past, how do I properly import stuff? How do I do this professionally? Because you don't want to mix everything up. You want to have a certain structure and order, and the guidelines have a section on that as well. So first of all, a no-brainer, don't import multiple modules in the same line. It just doesn't look good. So if you want to import, for example, the math module, the OS module, and the sys module, you don't want to do it like that. You don't want to say import math, OS, and sys. This is not recommended. You don't want to do that. What you want to do is you want to import them in separate lines. So you want to say import math, import OS, import sys. This is how you want to do it. Also, if you have the same module, you want to do it in the same line. So if you say, for example, from sklearn.preprocessing, if I want to import something from preprocessing, I don't start a new line for each thing I import. So for example, what do we have? Standard scalar, for example. If I want to import the standard scalar, and I also want to import something else like the min-max scalar, I'm going to do it like that in one line of code. I'm not going to say from sklearn preprocessing import standard scalar, and then again in the next line from sklearn.preprocessing import min-max scalar, and so on. This doesn't make a lot of sense. It's the same module. However, if I say from sklearn, I mean, this is obviously something I need to do, but if I do model selection, for example, then I start a new line, but I import everything in the same line. So from model selection, I say, for example, train test split, maybe grid search CV, and so on. I do all of this in the same line. And one important thing, we want to avoid wildcard imports. What are wildcard imports? This is something like from sklearn.preprocessing import everything, because this then imports everything, of course, which is, pleasant, because I can just then use everything without specifying that I want to use it. But the problem is that it makes unclear which names are present in the namespace. And sometimes this is problematic because in Pillow, for example, we have an image. Then we also have an image in CV2. We have an image in TK Inter. I'm not sure where we have an image, but you don't know what's important now, and maybe you don't even need the image from a certain library, but you have imported, or you imported it because you did a wildcard import. So you want to avoid those. And the last thing that is actually quite interesting is the order of the code, how you write it. Now, if you write professional code, what you usually do is you start with docstrings. So you say something like author equals whatever you are. So I actually think I should have here somewhere the vidstream module where I actually did it. Not perfectly, but you can at least see the docstring. So you can see here I have a docstring with this module implements the main functionality of vidstream, author Flo Rendetto from Neural 9 and so on, YouTube channel and all that. Then these variables representing my contacts and all that, contact information. You want to have this first in your modules, in your scripts. Then you want to have the imports. And when you do the imports, you want to have three sections. First of all, you want to have all the imports that are from the standard library. Stuff like import OS, import sys, import math, and so on. And of course, also stuff like from math, import sqrt, and all that. Whatever you want to have it in one section here. And once you have that, you start a new section separated by a blank line, and you import all the third-party imports. So for example, import numpy snp, import matplotlib.pyplot splt, and so on. And then, in case you need it, you have a third section with your local implementation. So for example, as you can see in vidstream, I have two files. If in the streaming file I want to use the audio.py, what I do is I have to import it as well. So I can say import audio, whatever. So I have to import my own things, my own local implementations last. Here I have the third-party modules, and here I have the core Python modules. This is important. After that, we have the globals and constants, but this is important when it comes to the imports. Now, the third category is about commenting guidelines. How do we write proper comments? And I want to mention right away that all this here is not proper commenting. Those are just notes for this video here. They're violating the guidelines. This is just for me right now for making this video. But one major thing that you want to keep in mind when you're working with comments is you always want to keep them up to date. I think this is a no-brainer. This is obvious, but you never want your comments to contradict your code. You always want to have them up to date because Oftentimes we change the code real quick, we add something, we remove something, we change something, but we don't update the comments. And this is really, really bad, because when someone looks at the code, they're going to see a comment that says this code does XYZ, but the code does ABC, and it's not good. You don't want to have that. You always want to keep your comments up to date. Also, less intuitive, you want to comment in complete sentences. So when you write comments, you want to have complete sentences with a capitalized beginning. Now, important, when we say capitalized beginning, we don't want to alter the case of identifiers. So for example, if I have something like def my function, and I don't know, I have a parameter param, and this function does something. If I write some comment here, I don't know, param does XYZ, it's important that I don't capitalize param, because param is an identifier. It has this name. I'm not going to change the P to an uppercase P. If we refer to certain keywords, function names, class names, parameter names, whatever, we want to keep the case, but otherwise you want to use full sentences, and you want to use a capitalized beginning. Now, when it comes to block comments, we want to have one or more paragraphs of full sentences. And important, when you write comments, always write them in English, unless you're 100% sure that the people you're working with are the only people that will ever see this code. You're never going to use it for anything else. It's only going to be used by 5 German speakers or 5 French speakers. Then write in your language if you want to, but always use English, because you're going to need this to be compatible. Also, in general, in computer science, English is the language. I'm also not a native speaker. My native language is German, but still, I always use English, because English is the language of the internet and the language of computer science. When you are a computer scientist, English is a must-have skill. It doesn't matter which language you're born with. You should know English, and you should use English when commenting, when naming your functions, and so on. Doesn't mean that your messages, your error messages, and so on can't be in your language, but the code should be written in English, and also the comments, obviously. Now, inline comments are a thing that should be used sparingly according to the guidelines. You should not use inline comments too much. What are inline comments? When you have my function here, and I have this pass statement here, and I have this inline comment, this does nothing, for example. First of all, you don't want to use them too often. Second of all, you want to use 2 spaces at least. This is the convention. You want to use 2 spaces in between the statement and the comment. I don't know why. I don't think this is intuitive, but yeah, the guideline says this is how you do it. And also I saw that Python or PyCharm tells me PEP8 at least 2 spaces before inline comment. And I think this is also important. Don't state the obvious. Don't write comments that are unnecessary. For example, this here, pass, this does nothing. Okay, we know it does nothing. Or if I have something like x equals y to the power of 2. And then my comment is square y and save it to x. This is stupid, right? You don't want to do this. But of course, if there's a reason to write an inline comment, like this statement triggers something that is not obvious to the reader, to the user, to the coder, then you might want to use inline comments to just mention, okay, this function has something that you don't see right away, and I want to mention this here. So next up, we have the Docstring Conventions. And for this, we actually have an own set of guidelines, which is the PEP 257, the Docstring Conventions here. If you want to read into that, feel free to do so. In this video, I'm only going to mention the most important stuff. You want to document, you want to write documentation for all public modules, functions, methods, classes, and so on. And the comments should come after the def keyword. So if I have a function, def my function, the documentation string should come after this. So I don't want to document like in Java, where you have Java docs. You would do it up here. No, you want to do it after the function definition. So in here, you want to have a doc string. You can see that it already automatically generates the format in PyCharm. So if I have x and y, and then I use this, you can see I have param, return, and this is the convention that you have it after the def keyword. And the 3 quotation marks at the end should not be on the same line unless it's a one-liner, but here we want to have the same line. So my function does something. So here we want to start in the same line. Here we don't want to do this. So this is always on a separate line. And that's all I want to mention here for the docstring conventions, because that could be a whole video in and of itself, how to write proper documentation. Actually, I have a video on docstrings already. You might want to check that out. But this is the basic thing. You want to document everything that's public, and you want to do it like that. You want to do it after the def keyword. Here you want to have in the same line the start, and this is on a separate line. This is how you write docstrings. All right, so now we get into something that is interesting and very important: naming conventions. How do we properly name variables, functions, classes, modules, packages, and so on? It's very important to follow these guidelines, because if you don't follow these guidelines, people are going to notice right away that you're not very experienced as a Python programmer, or that you're just ignorant. Both is not good. You want to follow these guidelines, because if you start using camel case for your functions, people are going to notice that you're really not a good programmer. And you probably are not if you're doing it, unless you have a certain reason to do that, of course. But let's start with a very basic, simple principle. First, you don't want to use function names that are indistinguishable from numbers like 0 and 1. So, for example, uppercase I, lowercase l, or uppercase O are letters that are oftentimes indistinguishable from 1 and 0. In my font that I'm using here, it's not the case, because if I type 0, you can see that there's a dot in 0, there's not a dot in O. But in some fonts, this is not the case. In some fonts, these things are indistinguishable, and it's just a bad practice to use these names. So just avoid them where you can. Now let's get to the actual naming conventions. When we talk about modules, like vidstream, for example, you want to use, or actually modules are something like pre-processing from sklearn, and sklearn is the package. So in both cases, you want to use lowercase short names. With modules, you can also use underscores if it improves the readability. So if you have a very long module name, you might want to use underscores. In packages, so vidstream, for example, you don't want to use underscores. It's not recommended to do so. It's better to just pick in an all lowercase short name. For the modules, if necessary, if it improves readability, also use underscores. So if we have, for example, I don't know, my new package, this could be your package name. And from my new package dot, I don't know, special math tools. This could be a module that you use in order to import something. So this is fine, but in the package name itself, you should not have underscores. This is discouraged at least. Now, classes should go with camel case or cap words, basically meaning that if you have, for example, inside of your package, a class, you want to call it my new class, like that. You don't want to call it my new class in mixed case, so you don't want to have a lowercase m in the beginning. You don't want to have, in general, lowercase or all uppercase. You want to have this camel case where you start with a capital character, and the individual words here are always started with an uppercase character. So this is the convention for classes. So if you have a package, module, and a class name, what you want to do is you want to say from my package dot special math module, for example, import math calculator, for example. This is how it would look like if you follow the conventions. So for type names, this is a thing that I haven't talked about on this channel, so I'm not going to talk about it too much now. But if you have types that you define, so you can say something like, if you define types, you want to also have this suffix with co for covariant or contra for contravariant. So you have this type var. Again, I'm not going to talk about this too much, but when you define a type var, you can define a certain name, and you can set covariant to true or contravariant to true. And then you also want to have this suffix in the end to indicate that this is the case. Just if you know what this is, just use this. Otherwise, I'm going to make a video maybe on it in the future. Exceptions are actually like classes, because exceptions are classes, but you want to add a suffix error. So you can say, for example, my new math error, for example. You want to end this with error if it is an error, but essentially the naming convention is the same as with classes. Now, functions and variables should all be lowercase separated by underscores. So if I have the function, I don't know, def iterative Fibonacci solution, this is how I should do it. I should not go with mixed case or camel case unless, of course, the style is already present in the project. Obviously, this is always the case if you are in an ecosystem where there are other conventions you need to follow. Those, obviously, but you don't want to do something like Fibonacci iterative or something like that. You don't want to do this because that is not the Python convention. In Python, we use lowercase with underscores for variables and for functions. Now, when you have a class, my class, and you have some function in there, my function, you want to use self if it is an instance method, so if it is something related to the actual object, and you want to use CLS if it's for the class. So this is just a convention here. Also, this is very important. This is something that I didn't do. If an argument name clashes with certain reserved keywords, so if you want to pass something like class, for example, but class is already a Python keyword, or maybe if, or for, or while, then it is better to go with a trailing underscore instead of abbreviations. So class underscore is a better name than CLSS, for example. This is just more readable. You should go with that. If you have to use something, it's better to avoid it in the first place. But if you have to use class, go with class underscore. Also, private and protected resources should be indicated with underscore and double underscore in classes. So if I have, again, class my class, and in the init function here, I want to have a certain variable. I can say, okay, my name equals whatever. So this is a private attribute and so on. You can look at vidstream. I do it there as well. So you want to just indicate that this is actually also important for the IDE because it's going to notice that certain things are protected and others not. And obviously, I think this is the same for all languages: Java, C, C++, C#, Python. Constants are in all capital letters in Python, separated by underscores. So if I have, for example, pi equals 3.141 and so on, this is a constant. Or my port, or we can say port underscore number is 49s, for example. This is how you define constants in Python. All right, and last but not least, we're going to talk about some general programming recommendations, just two of them that I want to mention here, because one thing that beginners oftentimes do is they have a Boolean, for example, I don't know, condition, and this condition is somehow calculated and it's then true or false. So let's say it's true. What they oftentimes do is they say, okay, if condition equals true, then do something, right? First of all, you can see here right away that PyCharm says this is not efficient. This can be replaced by condition. So you can just say if condition. Why? Because an if statement needs a Boolean. You don't need to compare it to a Boolean because it's already a Boolean. So if the condition is true, you can just say if condition. Also, same goes for a function that returns a Boolean. If you have a function, my function, and this function does some calculations and it then has some result, and this result is true, you don't have to say if result equals true or if result then return true. You can just say return result. And this is fine as well. Just some basic stuff here. And another thing, the last thing I want to talk about today is if you want to compare, if you want to see if something is none or not, you can do it in multiple ways. When it comes to the functionality, it doesn't really change, but it's not a best practice to do it like that. If you have some x and x is equal to none, you don't want to check by saying if x is not none. This is not good because what happens here is you ask if the variable x is the negation of none. You don't want to do that. This is a bad practice. What you want to do is you want to check if it's not true that x is none. This is just what you want to do here. So just a basic tip on the side. And that's it for the Python coding conventions. This is how you can write more professional and more readable code in Python. So that's it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed and I hope you learned something. If so, let me know by hitting a like button and leaving a comment in the comment section down below. Also, don't forget to check out the link in the description down below and the coupon code of the sponsor of today's video, Oxel Labs. And as always, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell to not miss a single future video for free. Other than that, thank you very much for watching. See you in the next video and bye.